Welcome back to the channel, guys. Gaston right here. Today, we are going to talk about the Sony A7 IV, but unfortunately, this is not the type of video that you're expecting for me to do. But it is what it is because the news is not that good. So let's get started. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Gaston right here. Let's talk about the Sony A7 IV because you guys have been so anxious. The most popular topic right here in the channel. Now, before I continue, remember that I do gear reviews, tutorial behind the scenes. So if you enjoy this type of content, subscribe to the channel, enable notifications for more content like this one. So Gaston, what the hell is going on with the Sony A7 IV? You know, you made several videos before, your sources share some information with you, and what happened right now? And I have people messaging me on Instagram and on YouTube in the comments almost daily. Guys, the sole reason why I haven't done a video is because no one has any information about this camera. Now, the one thing that we do know is that camera manufacturers, such as every single electronic manufacturer right now, is struggling. Dell Computers is struggling. Apple Computers is struggling. Canon is struggling. Pretty much everyone in the tech industry is struggling to get components, you know, to build their products. And this is a situation that was created because of COVID-19. Now, I was reading an article from Bloomberg, and it says that by 2022, first quarter of 2022, this situation should be resolved, and hopefully we're going to see a lot of these releases that have been postponed or have been delayed coming up in 2022. Now, let's go back to the Sony A7 IV because, like I mentioned before, you know, we shared some information, was pretty much on par with what other rumor sites were saying. But Sony A7 Rumor actually reported today in their site with pretty much the same information that the Sony A7 IV, you know, is most likely delayed because of those manufacturing issues. Now, take, for example, the Sony ZV-E10A camera that was postponed twice. So that camera was supposed to be announced 2 months ago, and they postponed it twice. And we don't know when that camera is going to be announced again, hopefully next month. Sony A7 Rumor is saying that we may probably see an announcement of the Sony A7 IV at around by the end of the year. But to be honest with you guys, knowing and reading about other camera manufacturers, most likely this camera is not going to see the light until 2022. And most likely it's going to happen in the first quarter, specifically kind of like at the end of the first quarter. Now, let's rephrase a little bit about the features of the Sony A7 IV, what we think that this camera is going to be about, because once again, other than a leak here and there, we don't really know what this camera is going to be about. But since the time we started reporting about this camera, a lot of cameras from Sony have been released, so we have a pretty good idea where this camera needs to be in order not to compete with other cameras and have enough contrast when it comes to price and feature. Let's talk about the first one, the sensor. Will the Sony A7 IV have a brand new sensor? And in my opinion, is that Sony has to have something different and pretty much ditch that 24 megapixel sensor that they have been using for a while. Now, the word is that this camera may use a 30 to 32 megapixel sensor, and as a result of that, most likely we're going to have also a brand new processor. Now, let's talk about codecs. This one is a big one because the Sony A7 III has been a very popular hybrid shooting camera. A lot of people using for photography and video, and some people for video only. So this camera is going to offer some of those awesome 4K codecs, but I think that we're going to see some crippling here going on. The first one is that the camera most likely is going to record in 4K video 10-bit, but I don't think it's going to be 422, and I think the Sony may actually cap it at 420. Now, why do I think that? Well, put it this way. The Sony A7S III costs $3,500 and the Sony FX3 around $3,800. And now imagine this camera having a higher megapixel, having 4K up to, let's say, 30p, 10-bit, 422. Pretty much if you have $3,500 or $2,500 to get a camera like this one, most likely a lot of people, especially those focusing on video, are going to go with a camera like the Sony A7 IV. Also, the Sony A7 IV, if it has the 30 megapixel, is going to be a great still camera. So Sony has to divide those features because cameras such as the Sony A7III and the FX3 are more dedicated for video. And here we have a camera with higher resolution that is going to be kind of like the best of both worlds. So Sony will have to cripple video codecs somehow. So, you know, the choice is actually very clear. Now, I think that we're going to have some fast frame rates, and I don't think we're going to have 4K up to 120 frames per second. I think that Sony is going to cap it 4K up to 60p, and once again, most likely maybe also 420. Now, 420 sounds ridiculous because probably they can give us that technology without increasing the cost of anything. Most likely, they're going to try to reuse some of the processor that they're using already. So again, Sony has done this before. They have actually removed features in order to keep, the contrast in price between cameras, and also to keep the features, pretty distant one camera to the other. Now let's talk about one of the most important things that people want to see in the Sony A7 IV, and this one is going to be the flip-out screen. Now by now we know that cameras such as the ZV-1, the Sony A7Siii, the Sony A7S3, and the FX3 had a flip-out screen, and by default, this camera is going to have the same flip-out screen. Now, will we have the brand new menus with touchscreen capabilities? And if you ask me, I think the answer is going to be no, because they could have done it with the Sony A7C, or they could have done it with the Sony ZV-1, brand new cameras, but they decided not to put that technology there. Now, we have it in the Sony A7S3 and the Sony FX3 and in the Sony A1, so it tells me that Sony is going to hold on to this technology a little bit longer for the much more expensive cameras. And what we're going to have in here is pretty much the same old menu that's been working fine, no problem. But if there is one thing that I wish that Sony would do in this camera, and I think the Sony A7 IV is the perfect camera to do so, is to allow users to change ISO, shutter speed, and aperture from the screen itself, from the front of the camera, because the Sony A7 III, just like the Sony A7 IV, will be one of the most popular hybrid shooting camera. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is the ports, because Sony has been using that micro HDMI port that I cracked it once, and I think that it is time to put that port in all the cameras full frame, and they have done it in the Sony A7 III again, the Sony FX3, and the Sony A1. So chances are that we may see the full-size HDMI in the Sony A7 IV. I think that is going to be a great call from Sony, and they may save a lot of money in repairs. Now, when it comes to body, the Sony A7 IV will have pretty much the same body as the Sony A7S III, with a thicker grip and the brand new buttons that are a little bit more bulkier and clicker. Now, this is another question that a lot of people want to know. Will the Sony A7 IV have a Cinetone? And to be honest with you, I think that Sony is going to reserve that for the cinema line, or for the cameras that pretend to be a cinema camera, such as the Sony A7S III and the Sony FX3. By the way, I love those two cameras. I'm not trying to bash them. But yes, I think that Sony is going to remove that feature from this camera. I think would actually be way too much for your money, in Sony's world, and they're just gonna keep it away. In terms of battery, by now Sony hasn't changed that battery, so it's safe to say that we're still gonna have the same MPF Z100 battery. Now, the one thing is that Sony has actually extended the life of the battery, with newer releases, much more efficient processors. So the Sony A7 IV could actually have better battery life without actually having to change the whole battery. Now, what about the EVF? Will the Sony A7 IV have a brand new EVF, perhaps the 9.44 million dots? And in my opinion, absolutely not. And I don't even know if Sony will even change the EVF from the Sony A7 III. I think that Sony may give us the same EVF that we have in the Sony A7 III. They're gonna try to keep this camera cheap. They're gonna try to put as many features as possible, but also they're gonna be very careful keeping the camera around the $2,500 and not killing the other much more expensive ones. Now, when it comes to image stabilization, we are gonna see a big deal here, because chances are that we're gonna have the active image stabilization along with gyro data. Now, look at cameras such as the Sony ZV-1. That camera has active image stabilization, gyro data. It works really good. I mean, it's not like you're gonna replace the gimbal. But on cameras such as the Sony A7C and the FX3, the gyro data and the active image stabilization works really good. I made one of my last videos showing the active image stabilization of the Sony A1, and it performs almost like if you're shooting with a gimbal. So I think that, again, this is the perfect camera to have that feature. If Sony does not put the active image stabilization, people are going to be pissed off. I'll be pissed off, because it's a great feature to have, especially for a hybrid shooting camera. So guys, when do you think that we are going to hear about this camera? And like I mentioned before, forget about 2021. I mean, I wish the camera would actually be announced in 2021, but Sony has a couple of releases this year. One of them is the Sony ZV-E10, and most likely we are going to see this camera sometimes 2022, possibly at the end of the first quarter. So guys, this is gonna be it for today. Let me know which ones are the 3 features that you must have in the Sony A7 IV. Drop them down below in the comment, and as always, subscribe to this channel for more content like this one. I'll see you in the next video.